to the Title IX Grievance Process Training. This training is for school-based Title IX coordinators, investigators, and decision makers. We get started on the grievance process. Let's first do a quick overview of what Title IX is. Title IX is a comprehensive federal law that prohibits discrimination based on sex. This includes sexual and gender-based harassment and sexual violence in any federally funded education program or activity. This policy applies to sexual harassment that occurs within the district's education programs and activities, and that is committed by a member of the school district community or a third party. This policy does not apply to sexual harassment that occurs off school grounds in a private setting and outside the scope of the district's education programs and activities. However, this does include school-sponsored programs and activities, whether they are on campus or off campus. This training, moving forward, is going to cover everything that you are going to need to know to successfully navigate the Title IX grievance process. Before we get started, though, let's review how the Title IX policy defines sexual harassment. Sexual harassment is defined as conduct on the basis of sex that satisfies one or more of the following. First, a school employee conditioning the provision of aid, benefits, or services on the individual's participation in unwelcomed sexual conduct, or unwelcomed conduct that a reasonable person would determine to be so severe, pervasive, and objectively offensive that it denies a person equal access to the education program or activity. Or sexual assault as defined in the Clery Act, or dating violence, domestic violence, or stalking as defined in the Violence Against Women Act. We're also going to review the different roles and responsibilities to make sure we're all on the same page and everybody's clear. In any allegations of sexual harassment, you will have a complainant and a respondent. And a complainant means an individual who is alleged to be the victim of the conduct that could constitute sexual harassment. And the respondent means an individual who has been reported to be the perpetrator of the conduct that could constitute sexual harassment. Then we'll have a Title IX coordinator. And this, at the district level, will be the Director of Student Services, and at each school-based site will be an assistant principal. The next role is the investigator, and this can be the same person as the Title IX coordinator. So our recommendation is that an assistant principal serves as the school-based Title IX coordinator and the investigator. And then for the decision maker, this will be the principal. In the case of an appeals, there'll be an appeals decision maker, and that will be the assistant superintendent of strategic planning and support services, and a hearing officer, and these are only going to be applicable to the post-secondary students, and that will be coordinated by the Director of Student Services. But what if one of your administrators is out and there has been a report? For secondary, an assistant principal will step in to fill the vacant role. And for elementary, the school counselor will become the Title IX coordinator and investigator, and whichever administrator is still on campus will become the decision maker. One final key term that we're going to go over before we get into the process is a notice of report. When the district has actual knowledge of sexual harassment in its education program or activity against a person in the United States, it shall promptly respond in a manner that is not deliberately indifferent. So this means that the Title IX coordinator knows directly, or an official who has the authority to take corrective action knows directly. We have created a Title IX manual, which includes detailed instructions for the Title IX process and forms, all the forms that you need to complete an investigation, definitions, contact information, and this is located in the handbook directory, which we'll go over at the end of this training. On page 9 of the manual, you will find the flowchart outlining the Title IX process. This first flowchart is for the process for K through 12 students. On the following page, you will find the flowchart for the post-secondary students. The difference for the post-secondary students is the hearing. Remember, the hearing is mandatory and must be recorded, but that's only for post-secondary students. Title IX coordinators, this is going to be important. You have a checklist. This checklist will walk you through everything that you need to make sure that each step that you need to take. This can be found in the manual on page 24. So now what we're going to do is we're just going to go step by step through this flowchart, because we want you to come back to this flowchart whenever you have to go through this process. Once a report has been submitted, one thing you need to really pay attention to on these are the time periods you have to complete these steps. So the first thing that needs to happen is an initial meeting within 2 days max, and supportive measures need to be offered during this meeting. Just note that if the report involves an allegation of sexual harassment by an adult, you will notify the Director of Human Resources. So this training is going to walk you through the process for when students are involved, but we want to make sure that you know what to do if an adult is involved. At this initial meeting, you are required to offer supportive measures. So what are supportive measures? Supportive measures involve non-disciplinary, non-punitive individual services offered as appropriate, as reasonably available, and without fee or charge to the complainant or the respondent. Supportive measures must be offered to the complainant after a report of sexual harassment is made, and regardless of whether a formal complaint is filed yet, and to both the complainant and the respondent after a formal complaint is filed. So what are supportive measures? Supportive measures may include counseling, extending deadlines, maybe adjusting coursework, modification of schedule, campus escort, making sure they're safe, mutual restrictions of contact between the parties that could require changing a lunch period or having one student leave early to walk to their next class, something like that. Change in work location or leave of absence. Those are going to be more for adults. In the manual, there is a form to walk you through this initial meeting. You can find this form on page 29 of the manual. So after you've had this initial meeting, the next step would be for a formal complaint to be filed, signed by the parent, the student, or in some circumstances it could be submitted by the Title IX coordinator if a parent refuses. Once that formal complaint has been submitted, the very next step is to determine if the complaint meets all three of these requirements. So to qualify to go through the grievance process, it must meet all three of these requirements. Do the allegations meet the definition of sexual harassment? We went over that earlier. There in the policy on board docs, you will find a more detailed description of this, so I advise you to refer to that when you get to this section. Did the conduct occur in an educational program or activity? And did the allegations occur against a person in the United States? If you answer yes to all three of these, then you will move to the next step and go through the grievance process. If one of these is no, then you will move to dismiss, and you have 2 days to submit the notice of the dismissal. You will find this in the manual. Just want to point out again, each individual has 2 days to request an appeal. So if the decision is made to dismiss, each party has 2 days that they could appeal. This can be found on page 45 in the manual. I recommend that when you submit a notice of dismissal to the complainant, that you also attach the appeal form, which is also in the manual. All right. Now, we're going to move into that grievance process. Once the formal complaint is made, it is determined that, yes, this meets all three requirements. We're moving into this grievance process. Written notice of the allegations needs to be submitted to both parties within 2 days. This document, again, in the manual, walks you through everything that you need to make sure that you include in this information. All right, now we're going to move into this bigger section. You've submitted written notice of the allegations, and you're going to begin the investigation. Remember that all interviews have to have proper notice. People need to know when things are scheduled, and you need to make sure that you are communicating with both parties at the same time so that everybody's receiving all of the information. You will find this written notice of Title IX investigation interview document in the manual on page 33. As the investigator, you will conduct the interviews and you will collect all the evidence. You will be putting together a report, but prior to that, you need to provide all of the evidence to each party. Each party has 10 days to submit a written response to the investigator for consideration prior to the conclusion of the investigation report. Make sure that before your final report is submitted or finalized, that each party has had 10 days to submit a response to any of the evidence that has, that is a part of the investigation. Once those 10 days are up, the investigator will finalize their report and send it to all parties. When gathering evidence, it's important to make sure that all the evidence is relevant and pertinent to the issue presented, and investigators must take an impartial stance. Evidence must be shared either through mail or electronic format before completion of the report, and both parties have the right to inspect and review and respond to any evidence obtained during the investigation that is directly related. You will find the form that you need, the Notice of Title IX Investigation Evidence, in the manual on page 35. And on page 36, you will find the Title IX Investigative Report. This report will walk you through making sure that you have completed each step. Remember, with the final report, you are going to send a final report to all parties and the decision maker. So it's important that at this point the decision maker gets all of the evidence and the final report so that they are able to then do their role of making a decision. When making a decision, it needs to remember that this final report needs to have an impartial tone. It cannot have any conflict of interest, and all parties are presumed innocent until the final determination. Once that investigative report has been finalized, all parties have 10 calendar days to submit a written response and to submit questions to be asked of any party or witness. Answers must be provided. The decision maker must determine if a question is relevant and explain any decisions to exclude a question. There is also a form for this, predetermined questions. So this is where you'll want to make sure that all parties get a copy of this form, and so that they can submit any questions that they have. And the decision maker will decide if they're relevant and should be answered, or if they are not relevant and going to be excluded, and make sure that if a question is excluded, that there is an explanation along with it. After that 10-day window, the decision maker will submit their written determination to both parties at the same time. So it's very important that everybody's getting the information at the same time. Once this determination has been made, either side can appeal. They have 3 days to appeal. So when this written determination is given to both parties, you should also go ahead and attach an appeal form, so that if they want to appeal, they already have the documents that they need. And they have 3 days to do this. So remember, if you are the decision maker, and when you are making this determination, that make sure due process is in the decision. Must be appropriately impartial and fair. That's in the findings and sanctions. Decisions should be based on fundamental fair policy or rule. Decisions must have a rational and reasonable conclusion based upon the evidence, and clear written determination to be issued to both parties and include violations. The written determination must include the following: a description of the procedural steps taken in the process, statement of rationale for the results, and should include supporting facts and application of policy to such, and sanctions imposed on respondent, any remedies provided to the complainant to restore or preserve access to the educational program or activity, and finally, information on procedures for an appeal. Decision makers, there is also a checklist for you, and this is important to make sure that you don't miss any steps. This checklist is a couple pages long and will keep you on track. You can find this in the Title IX manual on page 39. There's also a written determination form that if you follow each step on this and answer each question, you will ensure that you have completed all the requirements. So now we're at this appeal process, and this is where we start wrapping up the grievance process on the school-based end. You'll ask yourself if anyone submitted an appeal within 3 days. If the answer is yes, then at this point, you're going to turn this over to the district Title IX coordinator, who will organize the appeals process. The school must notify the other party in writing when an appeal has been filed. Remember, you want to make sure that everyone has clear communication through the whole process. And you will contact the district Title IX coordinator to implement the appeals procedures equally for both parties. If nobody appeals, then this is where the grievance process ends. Remember, a few slides back, I said that there would be attached to the written determination, there would be a notice of the right to appeal. So this is already on that form that you're going to use. And you should also attach a request for appeal so that they have what they need if they choose to. If they appeal and it goes on to the district, all parties will have 3 days to submit a written statement in support of or challenging the outcome of the determination. And then the District Title IX coordinator will work with the Assistant Superintendent of Strategic Planning for that final appeals decision making to happen, and written determination will be provided to all parties within 5 days. We have a new way of housing your documentation. Now in focus for the Title IX documentation, you will see under Student Documentation a section titled Title IX, and you will upload all of your documents there and choose whether it was a substantiated or unsubstantiated case of Title IX. So before we wrap this up, I just want to go over the resources that you have. You have the Title IX manual, and where you can find this is on our district website. If you go to the staff portal and to the handbook directory, that is where you'll find this manual, and this has everything that you need to successfully complete this grievance process. And another important resource is the actual policy. The policy goes into detail of exactly how different parts of this are defined, and you should always refer to that as you are going through this process. You can find that in board docs on the school district website. We thank you for your time, and if you have any questions, please reach out to the Director of Student Services, Dr. Paula Lewis. Have a great day.